is everyone in the room can hear you, and also people that are online. So please wait for that. A person will bring a microphone. And here, just on issues that we've just been discussing, we ask usually that people announce their name and affiliation. If you don't want to, though, that's fine. For some reason, you're going to be on TV anyway. But please, above all, make your comments in the form of a question. Let's begin with, I'm going to be very rude, by the way. I just pointed people since I don't know your name. The lady right in the middle. Yes, she still has her hand up. I will try to get to everyone.
Hi, my name is Rachel Oswald. I'm a journalist and one who is very concerned about press freedom issues. My question has to deal with dangerous speech, incitement to violence, what people usually say, don't cry fire in a movie theater. I'm wondering how that old adage applies to the digital age, or just the state of heightened spread of news and also heightened polarity. I'm thinking, for example, somebody wants to burn a Quran. We know historically that when someone in some corner of the world burns a Quran, there will be violence and possibly death in other corners of the world. And the people who disseminated the fake news story about the pizza parlor sex ring, when you know that certain kinds of information, that it is so incendiary that some people will be moved to violence for it. How do we treat that kind of speech?
You want to get that?
Well, to start with, when Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that famous line about shouting fire in a crowded theater, he said that no one would argue that it is protected to shout fire in a crowded theater falsely and cause a panic. When he wrote those words in 1919, it was a time when people were being sent to prison for advocating against American involvement in World War I. And the United States was using the Espionage Act even to punish dissident clergy members who would speak up, or presidential candidates. Fortunately, American law evolved from that point, and Oliver Wendell Holmes evolved after that point to be more speech protective. And so that the standard that was established showed that there had to be both an intent to cause an immediate lawless action and the likelihood that you would have that imminent lawless action take place. And so the First Amendment standard that developed was very protective. But now we face the situation, the second part of your question, where you ask about whether or not we have to anticipate that words online will be so inflammatory that we need to take some kind of action. And the danger is that if we anticipate that in a global medium, somewhere around the world is going to get cranky about it, and therefore we better start suppressing what people would say online, then you have lost freedom of expression. And so we're simply going to have to be able to deal with the fact that people are going to get upset at what they see or hear, whether it's burning a Koran or anything else, and that that's not going to be an excuse for limiting freedom of expression in the United States. I mean, we see this sort of, it's almost like grade escalation when we talk about threat assessments. People talk about having safe spaces and wanting to be protected from, any kind of upset. And what it's led to is the presumption by some that there is some kind of right never to be offended. And if that becomes the standard, then the First Amendment is history.
Yeah, can I just... Sure. I mean, I was involved in the cartoon crisis, and some of the issues that you raise, in fact, also informed the debate back then. And there were people who said you should have known, and therefore you shouldn't have published those cartoons. I think a couple of points. The interesting thing here is that all the violence during the cartoon crisis back in 2006 transpired in countries where individual citizens did not enjoy freedom of expression, where they did not have the right to publish cartoons. While there was no violence in democracies where this was not a criminal offense. That is, freedom of expression and tolerance had helped to work out a way of managing disagreements and offense in a way so that it did not lead to violence. And I think that is a very strong argument for not criminalizing these kind of things. The more fundamental argument is that if you understand human beings as autonomous individuals able to make up their own mind about what other people say. There is no automatic relationship between speech and violence. We, as individuals and as human beings, we have a mind and a reason and a capability to choose how we are going to react to what other people say. And if we ignore that human capability, we are undermining human dignity and reducing human beings to animals or to immature children that are not able to think for themselves.
Little one, I think there's a clear distinction to be made between inciting violence by, for example, urging people to burn down something or other, of which there seems to be a bit of that these days, and speech which merely offends people. And in that, I agree entirely with you. Would anyone be terribly worked up if the book in question were the Christian or Jewish Bible as opposed to the Quran? No. Would we want to make that invidious distinction? No. No, the question is, are you asking someone else to become violent? Not are you offering a fig leaf by which that person thinks he has the privilege to become violent?
The same argument was made, though, about flag burning, right? That one of the reasons why the government felt that it could prohibit that as a form of protest was because they said there would be these violent reactions. And ultimately the Supreme Court saw through that, including Justice Scalia saw through that and held that the First Amendment protects that activity, even if it is something that may well cause a violent reaction.
And also, I think there is a responsibility of the media here, because Terry Jones, the pastor you talked about in Florida, he had a segregation of 50 people, and he intended to burn the Quran in his backyard. It only became a worldwide event because world media showed up and provided him a microphone. And I think it was very unfortunate that Secretary Gates, in fact, called him up and asked him not to go ahead. And President Obama spoke about it on a talk show. In fact, being in charge of the executive, Obama called on a private citizen to seize his constitutional rights without being aware, in fact. I mean, it may be prudent to ask the pastor not to do it, but as president, you have to protect U.S. citizens' right to exercise their civil liberties, and among them, the right to freedom of expression. And I think that is really a slippery slope, and it's not only happening here, it's also happening in Europe when individuals do things that may create an angry response somewhere else in the world. They call on them not to go ahead without being very clear about what they really are doing. They are asking citizens to seize their fundamental rights and liberties in a democracy. I don't think they should do that.
Gentlemen, 4 up and 2 in, this way, from the bottom, right there.
My name is Stephen Shore. My question is, does the president know that we're having this discussion?
Watch your tweets.
Well, a good friend of mine works in the NSC, and probably does.
He could be watching. Yeah. Gentleman in front here. Now, there's more than one. The man in the middle. Using the random process.
Herb Rose. I come from a background where my father read one newspaper on the way to work when he took the subway. He read another newspaper on the way home from work. In my high school, you could get a subscription to the New York Times. I think it was something like 25 or 30 cents a week for the daily newspaper. So I come from a background and a time when people read newspapers and were concerned with what the media said. And this was also the early days of television. Today, you say that in the post-truth era, it's up to the individual to seek out the truth, to determine what sources are reliable. I think besides the people in this room, that represents a minority of people who form opinions. How do you encourage and increase the number of people to seek out reliable sources of news and information?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. I mean, I think it starts with education. It starts with a set of common understandings that the individual is autonomous and able to make their own decisions and have the obligation to make their own decisions. I think we should educate our children that they should not only seek out opposing opinions, but participate in discussions and debates. It all comes back to critical thinking. And if other people have better ideas for how to promote that, I'd love to hear them.
Well, you can think of one thing. You can think of how American kids do on PSAT tests compared to other countries, and the fact is we do terribly. And our K-12 schools fail students miserably. So, and then there are all the distractions of television and the like. You could start with better schools.
I think that there is a more fundamental issue here, and that is the way social media works and the way social media reinforces ignorance, I would say. It's not only about seeking reliable information, it's about exposing yourself to points of views that you don't like. Because social media the algorithm of social media is created in a way that it will seek confirmation bias. If you like and share, the things that fluctuates with your own point of view. And that's why during the campaign, a lot of people never came across a Trump supporter on social media, and they couldn't believe that he could win because they didn't know that there were anyone out there. And so I think a way to change this trend is that we more consciously like and share stories and information that is contrary to our own confirmation bias. Knowledge and facts are social phenomena. They only become facts and knowledge if they are part of an interaction between human beings. And it means that everything Trump says is only becoming fact, knowledge, if it's being accepted by his community of interpretation.
So I would say something positive.
Let me just say one little thing. There seems to be an assumption that most of our problems would be cured if people spent more time thinking about politics and reading about politics and listening about politics. And sometimes, don't you think you've had it up to here?
Well, yeah, I do. But I'm talking about not just politics. I'm talking about life. I'm talking about, arguing over who the best band is that you want to listen to and everything else that goes with it, the best restaurant. Politics is part of life, but it's not the most important part of life. Talking about having it up to here, I was laid up with a broken leg through most of the fall, so I saw more talk television, listened to more political commentary than I ever would willingly. Talk about a captive audience, that was me. And by the time Election Day rolled around, I couldn't listen to another minute of it. But when people talk about free expression, there is an assumption that it only has to do with electoral speech and political speech. And one of the wonders of the First Amendment is that the court has acknowledged that it protects all expression because all of life is filled with talk and communication about all of the ways in which people live, including sex. And that is why the First Amendment doesn't distinguish between which ideas are better than others or which ones rise to a certain level of that they're going to be protected. It is an open field to allow people to form their ideas about how they want to live. And politics is just a game we play here in D.C.
It seems like it's also, and get ready for this, I'm going to say something good about Trump and Obama, though. I don't know if that's happened at Cato before. President Trump's done a good thing in the sense that he's got a lot of people interested in politics, but more than that, he got them motivated and he got them to believe that there could be my impression is a lot of people who thought this is just hopeless and all of that sort of thing, he got them to believe in it. Now, he got them to believe in a certain way, right? Mm-hmm. So the other side, in other words, in being motivated and mobilized into politics, you start as an advocate, and then you meet with others, and you argue with others, and so on. And you have to take them seriously, and there's a development of a kind of civic capability there. And so President Trump got that going. What I think I would like to see is something like that President Obama did when people were talking about safe spaces and college students being protected from ideas. It'd be great to see President Trump say something like that, something that was really supportive of the culture of the First Amendment. And after all, this is a guy that gives as good as he gets, and he could put it in that context and all that stuff. But I'd like to, something positive could really follow up on his initial mobilization of these people who could become better citizens under the First Amendment.
And yet his impulse in hearing about the situation in Berkeley was to send out a tweet saying, deny federal funds. You know, while I appreciate the fact that he was saying good things about freedom of expression and that universities shouldn't cancel speeches because there is discomfort with the message, the notion that the way to deal with those situations is through federal coercion strikes me as just a little bit odd. Nonetheless, it gets back to how you view contrary ideas. And Fleming, you were talking about this, saying that the problem is everyone has their own biases reinforced. And you see that with the reactions on campus, where you see contrary ideas as being dangerous or unwelcome, and therefore you have a hostile reaction to it. And we should have, particularly in the university setting, but I think throughout society, just a more welcoming attitude toward ideas that you hate, you know, so that you can engage in that robust give and take. And we're not seeing that now. With the polarization, what we're seeing is shouting matches.
Let me just follow up on that very briefly. One of the greatest threats, it seems to me, to free speech comes from universities, and particularly universities, nearly all of whom have their offices of, you know, diversity, this, that, and the other, and are very quick to try to suppress people who have conservative views about anything. I don't have a particular problem about an administration that tries to defend academic freedom. I remember what the battle lines were like 50-odd years back when there were loyalty oaths. And at that point, it was places like the New York Times that properly came out in favor of free speech, and people like William F. Buckley, who wrongly, I thought, supported loyalty oaths. I'd like to see the defense of academic freedom coming from the Department of Education, and I'd like to see the New York Times oppose that.
Well, I agree with you there, and you know, just we haven't met before, but I spend about half of my time litigating First Amendment cases on college campuses, and I can tell you that it is, what would you call it, a vast bipartisan conspiracy to restrict speech, regardless of whether it's conservative or liberal. And my cases have involved students across the political spectrum. What you have is a bureaucracy that increasingly thinks that students can't think for themselves and that they have an obligation to protect them from anything that might upset them. It's a very unfortunate trend, and fortunately our constitutional protections are strong in that area.
Lots of questions.
The woman on the aisle about 4 or 5 in was first, showing intense interest, which leads to good questions.
My name is Maddie Pavic, and I'm a student at American University, where there has been some flag burning last semester and considerable protest. And I'm also from Minnesota, where there's currently bills being presented to restrict forms of protest. And I think that's a freedom of expression that hasn't really been touched upon in this panel, and I wanted to get your opinion and perspective on that.
On what?
On flag burning? Okay. Let me say something about flag burning, since you mentioned it. I think it's not improper for a country to promote a sense of nationalism. And I recognize that nationalism in other countries can be extremely dangerous. But I think there's something benign necessarily about American nationalism. And to understand that, you have to understand what it is which makes people American. It's not race, it's not religion. Rather, it's allegiance to some fundamental documents as espoused in the Declaration and the Constitution and the First Amendment and some speeches by Abraham Lincoln. And that's what makes you an American. And that's what makes a refugee an American once he comes here and comes here because he believes in those kinds of principles. And part of that involves the supremacy of those principles over the symbols like the flags. So it is glorious for the court to protect flag burners in defense of the more fundamental principles of that which makes one an American. So I salute that, the flag burning case. And of course, you know, if you want flag burning, the best thing you can do is prescribe it. Boy, that's when you'll see it, right?
That's right. I mean, the wave of flag burning that took place after the Supreme Court upheld the First Amendment right to protest using the American flag was unprecedented.
They don't burn flags elsewhere.
No, and if Quran burning is protected by the First Amendment, flag burning should be as well. In Denmark, where I come from, burning of flags of other countries is a criminal offense, while it's not a criminal offense to burn the Danish flag. And there were, in fact, nationalist parties who, when the Danish flag was being burned during the Khartoum crisis, also wanted to turn it into a criminal offense in Denmark.
Oh, actually, I just want to revise what I said earlier. The wave of flag burnings came in the wake of Congress trying to correct the Supreme Court that when it was going to be made a crime, then it became very attractive to do.
To go back just before we go to the next question, both presidential candidates presumably supported criminalizing flag burning last time. The gentleman right in the middle. Please wait for the microphone.
Bill Bushka, doaskdotell.com. Let me go in a slightly different direction.
Talking to the mic.
Yeah. Can you hear it? Okay. I think that there's a law called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which helps protect service providers from downstream liability. I think, is this likely to come under assault during the Trump administration? Over issues, the misuse of the internet, the cyberbullying, the terrorist propaganda, child pornography, sex trafficking, the Backpage case. Do you think I think that could be a serious threat to the whole system of user-generated content, although in Europe they don't have as strong protection of downstream liability as we do in the U.S. I thought that might get mentioned this morning. No one's mentioned it. And by the way, I don't have a problem with anything Milo says. Milo Yiannopoulos. I'm a little surprised. Just wanted to throw that out. He hasn't been mentioned this morning, but I wanted to throw that out too.
Doesn't have any problem with what Milo's.
I haven't heard anyone from the Trump administration talk about Section 230 specifically. First, for the president to say something about it, someone would have to explain to him what it is. But, and I don't think he would think it really affects him. I think there is constant pressure on Section 230, since it says that if you are an internet platform and you host the speech of a third party, you're not going to be held liable for it. It was almost an accidental protection that Congress adopted when it was really setting out to regulate the internet as if it was broadcast television. But anyway, that provision remained, and it has been an important driver of internet freedom, because otherwise, if you're the platform and you're going to be liable for speech that somebody posts, then you're going to have to be responsible for millions and millions of postings if you're Facebook or YouTube or Backpage.com. Under those circumstances, nobody's going to take the risk of posting anything. Now, the fact is, the internet is wide open. There's a lot of speech that people object to. And as a consequence, there is a constant pressure to revise Section 230. You'll hear talk about that in Congress. As I say, I haven't heard the White House talk about it. But I think Section 230 is secure. And by the way, Section 230 is backed by First Amendment protections, so that even if it didn't exist, I think the First Amendment principles that are enshrined in Section 230 would also be enforced by the courts.
I would just say, on the end of it, is speaking on behalf of my colleagues at the Cato Institute, I suspect, in fact, I'm sure that everyone that works with me does not, in fact, agree with Milo and the things he says. At the same time, I'm certain that all of my colleagues believes he had the right to say all of it. And the government, or to put it another way, the government had no power, including someone at Berkeley. But by the way, the Berkeley administration behaved seemingly pretty well, from what we can tell. So there's the two different things. It's always important. Government doesn't always have to be, to limit government, you don't have to be favoring what is said. That's crucial, I think. Now, gentlemen on the aisle here, I'm trying to go over, get everyone.
Thank you, Paul Cadero from the University of Toronto. I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts on how Donald Trump uses Twitter. And if you're Megyn Kelly, or Twitter and his public pronouncements, if you're Megyn Kelly, you can look after yourself. If you're Boeing, you can look after yourself. If you're a journalist from a small newspaper, or you're just a private citizen who gets attacked on Twitter, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, 6 in the evening, you maybe don't have the resources to protect yourself against death threats or or anonymous telephone calls or attacks by other of Mr. Trump's followers, 20 million, I guess. So I'm wondering whether that has an impact on free speech, in the sense that private individuals may be reluctant to say what they think, particularly on social media, because you don't know who's going to attack you. Maybe not the president, but the tone that goes to social media. The president's not the first person to do this, but there's a lack of civility that the president of the United States, by his own action, seems to endorse, condone, and indeed participate in.
I agree.
Well, let me say something for Trump, right? Actually, what I'll say is something about the American Constitution. What it lacks is that which Madison described as filtration. In other words, a system in which only the best would rise to the top. And he thought this would happen when you had a president appointed by Congress. Madison's ideas about the Constitution were, in fact, adopted, right? He is the father of the Constitution, except it's the Canadian Constitution I'm talking about. His filtration system is a system of parliamentary government. And so here you have the paradox that you have presidents who aren't filtered in that way, who don't have the experience of standing up before the opposition bench for years and years and honing your skill, right? You don't have that kind of filtration. But on the other hand, you have made the president the head of state as well as the head of government, and therefore he is someone who you are trained to revere. Now, look, I think politicians, nearly all of them, are about the lowest kind of worm God ever suffered to crawl upon the face of the earth. But in your Constitution, speaking as a foreigner for the moment, in your Constitution, somehow you've got to revere these guys, and if there is a tragedy, it requires a presidential healing speech over which Peggy Noonan will drop a few tears. And if there is something glorious, it requires a presidential medal. I think it should be done by Prince Charles.
Well, we have a system here, too, and we use reality television to filter our candidates. And they don't give up their Twitter accounts once they get elected, which is the problem I think you were talking about. It is a problem, but I don't think I'd connect it necessarily to social media. If you had a new president-elect who would have a nightly news conference and single out individuals and say, I hate that person, or that person is a loser, then I think you would have the same problem. The fact is, the president has used his Twitter account to single out companies, individuals he doesn't like, and there have been really unfortunate consequences. I actually heard a story on my commute. I have a long train commute to work every day, and I was talking to a friend who said he had an acquaintance who could now retire, And he was serious. I don't know if this is true, but he was serious, saying that he had this person that he knew who developed a system of following Trump's tweets and making trades in the market based on those tweets so that he could tell if a stock was going to go up or down, depending on what the tweets were. And in 6 months, the guy is going to retire. Now, I have no idea if this is true, but I wouldn't doubt it.
Yeah, I will agree with Bob. I don't think it has anything to do with the specific media, and it is a general challenge. But I think we are still living in a liberal democracy, and institutions do protect our right to speak out. So this is a question of individuals making decisions to speak out. I mean, it's not an anarchy. It's not a jungle. You can speak out. Yes, it may take some courage, but without doing any literal comparisons, it's the same with terrorism. I mean, the way you fight terrorism is by not letting you being terrorized. By doing that, you reduce a terrorist act to simple criminality, and not you take out the political content of it. So if people just sit back and feel intimidated, do not speak out, of course it will have consequences. But so it's up to everybody to make up their mind what they think about it and react.
So it follows from that, we've all done our bit to fight terrorism today because we've all sat in a room for an hour and a half now with Fleming Rose. I want to thank each of you for coming today. I hope you enjoyed this. I thought it was a very good discussion. You can continue the discussion upstairs during our lunch, which you go to the end, go up the stairs to the second level to the George Yeager Conference Center. The restrooms are on the second floor on your, look for the yellow wall when you're there. And I want to thank our guests, Fleming, Bob, and Frank. Good job, gentlemen.